Welcome to the Underground, the Steel City Underground, the black and gold standard for Pittsburgh Steelers coverage. Now, here are your hosts, Joe Kuzma and Christina Rivers.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of the Steel City Underground podcast. My name is Joe Kuzma, and I am joined today by maybe someone you don't hear from quite often. For those of you who are frequent visitors to our website over at steelcityunderground.com, however, may be very familiar with Christina Tina Rivers. She has almost like three names, just like a serial killer. Tina, how you doing today?
Good, and if you add like my real middle name, then I would be exactly like a serial killer.
Oh man, I don't know. I forget your middle name.
It starts with an L and it's awful. So
okay, we don't need that. We don't need to put it out there. But anyways, Tina is the associate editor here and pretty much my right-hand man, I guess, for, you really are. You're for everyone who usually listens here and knows that Brian's my partner in crime here on the podcasts. And, every so often, Zach Meckler or Coach Meckler or the professor or whatever we end up calling him, and he jumps in too. But you are quite the busy bee over on the website. And one of the things that Tina put out recently in the last week was an article about Mike Tomlin and should Mike Tomlin be considered a top-tier NFL head coach? And we're going to probably elaborate and expand on that even further because you've come up with a lot of research and numbers. I've done this in the past too, so we're kind of mashing and melding both of our little research projects together, both with a historical and a present day focus when it comes to Mike Tomlin. And there's quite a few Mike Tomlin haters that are out there. So I'm not sure exactly. Usually even if we tell them this, I know all the bullet points at this point about all the naysayers and everything like that. And I'm not sure we're going to turn heads too much or convince those folks otherwise that Mike Tomlin is a great head coach, and I'd say even beyond great. He may be in league to be a Hall of Fame coach, and I know he's done this for a long time. He hasn't had any losing seasons. I know people roll their eyes and go, what about that? What about playoffs, this and that? We're going to get into all those various many things, including maybe not including, because it could be another podcast all itself. The whole Mike Tomlin inherited Bill Cowher's players. Well, I hate to burst everyone's bubble, but Bill Cowher inherited Chuck Noll's players too. Bill Cowher didn't draft like Rod Woodson, for example. So there's, you can make these arguments until the cows come home, and also how Bill Cowher's final season wasn't even like a playoff season, and they fell from grace after just winning a Super Bowl and things of that nature. And you're going to have those ups and downs and roller coaster rides with any NFL franchise, but the Steelers have been, we say the black and gold standard here for us, but they have been a gold standard in the NFL when it comes to consistency, and part of that is because of Mike Tomlin. So, Tina, I'm gonna throw this over to you. I don't know, where should we start? Should we start present day? Should we start with comparing to past coaches, or where would you like to begin with this?
Well, one of the first things when I was doing the research for the article is I thought, well, how would you define the best coach in the NFL? Which is not easy because you'd have to sift through millions of statistics to determine like which ones carry more weight. How would you, what would be your definitive ranking? Do you go back to the pre-Super Bowl days? Do you count coaches that coach more than one team to championships? How do you do that? It'd be very subjective. And you could spend days breaking down that. So it just depends on what stat I think people see as mattering the most that defines best coach, which is really hard.
Yeah, I mean, that's, I guess that's everything in a nutshell. And, we could probably do a whole show on whether or not Mike Tomlin could be considered a Hall of Famer at this point. I think most of us feel another Super Bowl win is pretty much a lock. And I know you recall this because this was part of what I put in an article in the past too. And I had what was it, like a poll, and I had like John Madden, Marv Levy, I believe Tony Dungy, and Bill Parcells. It only lets you do 4 on the Twitter polls, and I had asked who had more Super Bowl wins as a head coach, and it was like pretty much 50% of the people got it right. Only half got it right with Bill Parcells, and of course the multiple team thing there too. And the common link there is obviously Marv Levy didn't win any with the Buffalo Bills, but we're talking about all Hall of Fame coaches. Aside from like a 1 or 2 that, like, you know, the Vince Lombardis of the world, you know, the guys like that are totally a head and shoulders above the Don Shula, for example. But I chose those 4 in particular. Maybe even Bill Parcells might be a little bit above that tier. But I really feel that Mike Tomlin is in that crowd or in that group, and you could certainly say with Bill Cowher and the former Cowboys coach Jimmy Johnson, those guys, they were supposed to go in this year. You know, there's no induction ceremonies and all this other stuff due to coronavirus. But I would think Tomlin kind of favorably compares with those guys.
Yeah, he does. And one of the charts that I did was everybody looks at, okay, well, the definition of a Super Bowl championship kind of defines the coach. If the coach can get a team to the Super Bowl and win the Super Bowl, then he must be a pretty good coach. Well, I took just the teams with the most Super Bowl wins, so the Steelers and the New England Patriots, and then went to the next tier, which would be the San Francisco 49ers and Dallas Cowboys that both have 5, and then Green Bay Packers and New York Giants claiming 4, and I just stopped there, and that was, sorry, I had to count for a second. It was 14 coaches, and out of those 14 coaches, only Mike Tomlin, Bill Belichick, George Seifert, Barry Switzer, Mike Holmgren, Mike McCarthy, and Tom Coughlin are ones that have not already been enshrined in the Football Hall of Fame or are still awaiting their ceremony.
Yeah, and so above all of that, obviously Tomlin only has the 1 Super Bowl victory of the 2 appearances, and that's the same thing with Bill Cowher. And now you see Tomlin is starting to kind of supersede Bill Cowher's numbers. Of course, you're never going to compare to Chuck Noll. Chuck Noll has 4. You know what I mean? The only guy that's probably in that conversation right now, Bill Belichick, obviously, with this whole run with the Patriots, which looks like it's falling apart, by the way. Every waning moment, there's new news of somebody that's not going to play this year for them, and having already lost Tom Brady and, you know, some of that stuff, it's going to be we're going to really see what Bill Belichick is made of. We've seen this with Mike Tomlin though last year. He lost like a whole ton of players. I know they still crawled to 8-8. There's some casual fans that sit out there and they cry, well, they didn't make the playoffs. We saw what ended up happening with the implosion the year before, where they should have been really great and things of that nature too. And I don't know that I really want to go into the present history so much just yet. But, you know, you're looking at the Steelers, who haven't had a losing season since when? Was it 2002, 2003, where they were technically under 500, and have never really, almost in my lifetime, have had much of a record. I mean, I was born in 81. I don't really have much of a memory of the Steelers being like a 4 or 5 win team for the most part. You got to go back definitely some ways. It's many years back. I'm looking right now. 6-10 was the worst that they have done this whole century. That was in 2003. The next worst season where they drop under 500 under Cowher 2 years in a row, 7-9 in 98, 6-10 in 99. The Steelers have just they've constantly done it. Knowles last year was a 7-win team. I know there were some bad teams in the 80s, but those teams were still winning 5-6 games. what I'm trying to say is that they've been better than the Bengals, or been better than the Browns, or even like the Detroit Lions. And yet there's some people out there that just won't cut Mike Tomlin some slack among some of the current coaches. Now, you mentioned a few names on the list already. Now, this is going to be interesting because Mike McCarthy's going over to the Cowboys, and, he's had his up and downs, and we saw what happened in Green Bay when he didn't have Aaron Rodgers, and they weren't even as competitive as what the Steelers were with a Mason Rudolph or a Devlin Duck Hodges last year. We've seen, let me see, who else can I really hate seeing Barry Switzer on this list. I mean, he does get credit. He did coach the team, I guess. You talk about he got the reins from Jimmy Johnson. And I mean, George Seifert's an interesting guy too, because he's a guy that's always been in my brain as, okay, he took over the 49ers teams. He had like Steve Young and stuff, but he also had a tremendous coaching career with the Carolina Panthers too. He was actually, until I started digging into this, a lot better than what I had actually thought. So, just how well does, I don't know if you have this by win percentages and things too. I mean, that's the tough part, is when you start to compare some of these coaches by just wins and losses. I mean, Don Shula lost a lot of games too, but he's also coached a team that has the only perfect season in NFL history. And I'm going to continue to knock on wood and thank Tom Coughlin, who's on this list too, for spoiling that, like 10 years ago or whatever, with the Giants beating the Patriots for their only loss of that season. But it's like, where do you put... I'm starting to run around in circles. I was going to talk about the present day coaches, and I got back into the historical context here. You look at Mike Tomlin, you look at the total body of work, and how much weight does it really carry that he, a lot of people complain, well, 8-8, is that really something to celebrate, or 9-7 and missing the postseason, or an early exit from the postseason? But when we looked at this and compared to somebody like a Hall of Famer like Tony Dungy, how is it really any different when he had guys like Peyton Manning and Marvin Harrison? And, Peyton Manning was known as the choke artist, right? And I think you also have some stuff with Andy Reid, who finally got over the hill here and won the Super Bowl this past year. I think you have some numbers on that too. So how does Mike Tomlin compare to some of these other guys?
Well, I think it'd be interesting to start just with Chuck Noll, Bill Cowher, and Mike Tomlin, just because, let's put the first thing to bed. Who was the better coach, like you said, since the last time they had a losing season? If you're going just by regular season win-loss percentage, Tomlin has, Tomlin has a .645 regular season win-loss percentage, compared to Bill Cowher's .623 win-loss percentage. And then you compare that to Chuck Noll, which was a .566. So if you just take win-loss percentage, and then we're talking regular season games only,
and a good number of them too. We can't put some of the other guys like that were Steelers coaches, or even others that only coached like 2 seasons, into that same conversation. It's not the same type of context versus somebody who's been doing this like 13 years,
Well, and actually it's a little bit unfair even to put Chuck Noll in, because Chuck Noll coached for 23 seasons.
Yeah.
So even if you take him out and you just compare Tomlin and Cowher, and with Cowher getting into the Hall of Fame and the whole induction ceremony being postponed, Bill Cowher coached 15 seasons. Mike Tomlin's coached 13, still active in the NFL. Cowher's regular season record is 149, 90-1, and Tomlin is 133, 74-1. In the playoff games, win-loss and percentage, Bill Cowher's was 12-9 with a .571 percentage, whereas Mike Tomlin was 8-7 with a .533 average. So, I mean, if you put Cowher and Tomlin next to each other, the only real difference is in the number of division championships that they've had.
Yeah, so do you have those numbers too? Because that was always my argument with Bill Cowher was, and I'm sure if we had social media back in the day, people would have been all over him for not being able to get over the big one and win an AFC title game.
Right. And under Cowher, they won 9 division championships, but the team's average finish in their division was 1.9 versus under Tomlin, the division championships, they've won 6, but the team's average finish in the division has been better at 1.7. So Tomlin actually has gotten his team closer to more seasons of winning their division than Cowher has. And it's kind of weird because it seems like, well, 9 is better than 6. How could the numbers be so different? And it's because you take the average. So Cowher's teams were more likely to be second in the division. And it's kind of hard to compare the statistics. When we're talking about it, sometimes it's hard to describe it in a way that when you see it visually in black and white, it kind of makes more sense.
Yeah, which I'll link your article here in the notes too, and I always find that problem too because when we start talking about like 0.566 or whatever, 566 versus 623 and 642, and well, just to put it out there, Tomlin's coached 208 games with 133 wins, 74 losses. So his 208 games, Cowher had 240, 149 wins. Okay, so Tomlin does have the higher win percentage and the highest in the franchise history, and but he still trails several seasons behind Cowher. Obviously, 240 to 208. Chuck Noll with 342 and 193 wins. He's still got 60 wins to go to catch Chuck Noll for the all-time franchise lead there, and maybe he'll get there too because now you're going to have more games in the regular season next year, God willing, whatever ends up happening this season. And then the other thing, which is interesting to point out too, I wonder if we could have done this exercise with Bill Cowher. I think this also changes some things too, is because you used to have the AFC Central. So second place is like, you got 4 division champions now in the AFC instead of just 3 when Cowher first initially took the reins of the team. So some of these things do end up being subjective and wishy-washy and things of that nature. However, the one thing I was going to point out here is we mentioned this in the past, adding an extra team to the playoffs, only having 1 bye team instead of 2 teams with a bye, right? Well, you end up in a situation where Mike Tomlin, I think it was it the first season? There was only 1 year where the Steelers missed the playoffs, and had there been an extra team that would have made the postseason, it would have always been the Steelers except for one, and they would have lost to a tiebreaker to the Tennessee Titans. I think it was the 9-7 season, and they would have been out by a virtue of a tiebreaker situation because they had the same record. That's phenomenal when you think about it. Could you imagine, though, if they did have the 7 postseason teams then in the AFC, since Tomlin has been head coach and he only misses once? Do you think that would change some of the naysayers out there? I mean, I don't know. Maybe they would still just argue then, however many playoff games he won or lost, which I'm going to get into next.
Yeah, see, and that's the thing. That's where it comes into the subjective, because everybody has a different definition of how they see. I mean, even players, and I put that in my article too. They had just done the NFL had just done an article, and they'd asked players. None were on the Steelers, unfortunately. It was all players that were in the playoffs last season. They asked them, what qualities do you want in a head coach, and what makes them a successful head coach? And so you almost have to start putting things side by side. But then you add that year with the tiebreaker situation. I mean, they didn't have any more games that they could try to win. It was, just the way it was. The tiebreaker was the way the tiebreaker went, and it was basically there was nothing Tomlin could do at that point to coach or outcoach. So I don't know how you necessarily blame him for that, since it was a tie.
Yeah, you really can't, and a lot of what I perceived and what I wrote initially back in 2018, mind you, was based off of one writer who I'm looking at these tweets now, and it's pretty interesting. That sparked the article. I actually included it in here, and I'm just going to read them out here. Scott Katchmer. Back in January of 2018, he says it's possible that Belichick is the only Hall of Fame coach who was active in, let's say, 2009 to 2015. I'll give guys like McVay and company the benefit of the doubt for the future. I'm not sold on Andy Reid if they never put in, Marty, Reeves, Knox, Cowher, Shanahan, Holmgren. Well, that didn't age too well because Cowher's in now, and I don't know where Mike Holmgren stands in all this too. That's kind of an interesting thing too. Successful with two teams, but kind of almost in the Andy Reid type category, a guy who had trouble getting over it. I think it's just our perception of weighting all of this by Super Bowl victories, or even Super Bowl appearances for that matter, if you go with conference championships, it's really thrown out the window because everyone looks at the Patriots and thinks that has to be the standard that every other team is judged by. You take them out of the equation, and that's not true at all. It's so difficult to get to the Super Bowl. Super Bowl wins, Super Bowl appearances are rare.
Yeah, and just some of the the coaches that you mentioned. I mean, Mike Tomlin has one Super Bowl win. So does Bill Cowher. So does Barry Switzer. So does Mike Holmgren, Mike McCarthy, and then you go up, and most of the rest have two. And these are coaches that are already in the Hall of Fame for the most part. Well, not Barry Switzer, not Mike Holmgren, and not Mike McCarthy. So when you go and look at the two, it almost looks like, Vince Lombardi. I mean, how much more famous of a coach can you get? Vince Lombardi, and he only has 2 Super Bowl wins.
Yeah, exactly. And you start to get into, we've talked about current coaches, and obviously Sean Payton with the Saints is one, and he's been to 15 playoff games. He's 8-7. That is the same exact number of playoff games Mike Tomlin's been in with the same exact record. Very interesting. Same as John Fox. Pete Carroll is 11-9 with 20 playoff games under his belt. I'm trying to see who else is here. McCarthy's, Maccarthy's 10-8 with 18 and 9 seasons in the playoffs. So you have Tomlin with 8. Let me see who else is here. Marv Levy, who's a Hall of Famer, 8 playoff appearances, or 8 seasons, I should say, with a playoff appearance, and he's 11-8. Cowher is 12-9 with 10 seasons. Joe Gibbs has 10 seasons as well with 17-7. He is also in the Hall of Fame. You have Bud Grant with 12 seasons. Mike Holmgren actually is here with 12 seasons too, which is interesting. He's 13-11. You're going to lose in the playoffs unless you go all the way, I guess. So the further you go, maybe the more important it is. Mike Shanahan's an interesting case study too, because he has 8 seasons, 15 playoff appearances, 8-6. So you assume if he goes in and makes another team makes it and he's one and done, he's right there with Sean Payton, John Fox, Mike Tomlin. Dan Reeves was noted on here as being another name. 9 seasons in the playoffs, 11-9. Chuck Noll was 16-8. Of course, they won 4 Super Bowls, so they ran the table 4 different times. Marty Schottenheimer, 13 times. He was 5-13. I mean, you talk about a guy who couldn't get it done. Andy Reid's just getting it done now 15 times. And 15-14, he's almost dead even 500 right there. A guy like Paul Brown, 15 seasons. I'm going right up to number 1 here, by the way. 15 seasons, 17 playoff games. See, this is different because Andy Reid has had 29 playoff games in 15 seasons at 15-14. So that's also something that's kind of relative. But I like the seasons because at least that means every year that they were coaching, these teams were competitive or won a division title, got in, wild card, whatever be the standard at their period of time. So Paul Brown, 9-8. Curly Lambeau, 5 seasons, 3-2. Tom Landry, 20-16. in the playoffs, 18 seasons. I mean, that's huge. Bill Belichick's also there with 18 seasons, 43 playoff games, which dwarfs everyone else that's on this list, by the way. Tom Landry and Don Shula are second here, both with 36. Don Shula is actually all-time winningest coach, regular season NFL history with 328 wins. George Halas is 318, only got his teams there eight different seasons. But Belichick and Landry at 18 apiece. And Belichick is third all-time in wins with 273. And you go down the list, it's Tom Landry, Curly Lambeau, Paul Brown, Andy Reid is over 200 with 207. Chuck Noll comes in at 9 with 193. And then, of course, some of the names he mentioned, like Dan Reeves, Chuck Knox. Believe it or not, Jeff Fisher is here, and Jeff Fisher coached 22 years, 173 and 165. That's a win-loss percentage of 512. He had made the playoffs in only 6 seasons and was 5-6. That's not necessarily a Hall of Fame caliber career. So again, all of these things are relative because win-wise, he has one more win than Bill Parcells, who's a Hall of Famer. Now, Bill Parcells has 2 Super Bowl championships to his credit. 10 seasons in the playoffs, 11-8. So these are all interesting things here when you start to get into some of it. Tom Coughlin too. People don't think about him. 9 seasons, 12-7. So I don't necessarily want to call Mike Tomlin a Hall of Fame coach just yet, but just by regular season wins here, he's 25th overall. If you go with years in the playoffs, Mike Tomlin is 23rd, well, kind of tied in here. I hate how this table sometimes sorts. So we could say...
I was looking at that same table.
He's kind of tied for... Okay, we'll say with 20 because when you start to sort this, it starts to go kind of in alphabetical order, and it has Halas first. So there's only 19 other head coaches in NFL history with more playoff appearances in seasons. And as far as however many games that they've played overall, Tomlin is 22nd here with 15. And this is going to be the one where everybody starts to be the naysayer, and they're like, well, he's only won like 8 playoff games. Well, that's still in here at 24th. Those are all top 25 all time. That's not even the guys that are current here as current coaches in the NFL. And
right.
Of course, there's a few other names that are, mixed in here. John Harbaugh, Pete Carroll, Andy Reid, Bill Belichick, Sean Payton. Tomlin and Sean Payton are almost neck and neck here. Harbaugh will flip in certain situations, as will Pete Carroll, and obviously Andy Reid, depending on how you want to put it, because if you start to go into playoff losses, Don Shula's tops all time, Tom Landry, then it's Andy Reid, Marty Schottenheimer, and Bill Belichick. Those are your top 5. So you don't necessarily want to say that playoff losses is your benchmark, because getting to the postseason means you're in the tournament, you're in the dance, and that means that your team had a pretty successful season. So I don't know why everyone necessarily discounts Mike Tomlin's, achievements, I should say. God, I'm going to get ripped probably for that for some of the naysayers that are out there. But you did it here. You have Tomlin compared. I just mentioned Don Shula, who coached 33 years. I stole your stat there. I'll let you get the rest of your thunder. And Bill Cowher, who coached 15. Tomlin has coached 13 and is still active. And then Chuck Noll was 23rd. So when you just kind of put them all together, the regular season win-loss, we already said Tomlin was better than Cowher, but when you go by win-loss percentage, Tomlin is here at 19th, but some of these guys didn't coach even like 100 games. It's really tough for me to have. You have Guy Chamberlain who coached 81. It's like what in for 6 seasons. So where do you put him by that criteria? John Madden is probably the guy here who's most favorable, and I believe it was Shula, Madden, and Joe Gibbs, and Mike Tomlin, I think, is the 4th guy in that had 10 winning seasons in a row as a start with the head coach. Of course, Madden only coached those 10 years, and he only has the one Super Bowl championship to go with it, and he only got there 8 seasons, Tina. 9-7 sounds a lot like my guy Mike Tomlin, and I always make these comparisons, and people are like, "No, you're completely wrong." And it's like, hey, it's just here in black and white.
Yeah, and it's pretty hard to argue with that. And something else that a lot of people don't take into account is that you go back a certain amount of years, and they weren't playing. It wasn't a 17-game season.
Yeah.
The further you go back, the seasons were shorter. So how many teams made it to the playoffs because there was only 10 games in a season, or they went to 14 games? And I even put all that into, I mean, I had probably about 10 spreadsheets going at the same time. And by the time I got done comparing all this stuff, my eyes felt like they were crossed. But there are so many, like the one that you're reading that has Tomlin tied at 25th. That chart really kind of illustrated and put it into a picture of, you know, okay, we're gonna consider all the stats and put it all together and tell you who the people are from 1 to 25, and the fact that Mike Tomlin, being one of the youngest coaches, or at the time, he's still pretty young, that he's even in that, as high as he is in the list, is something that Steelers fans should feel fortunate about, maybe not so negative about.
Well, they're entitled. That's what it comes down to. And even the John Madden comment, John Madden has the same problem Mike Tomlin has. John Madden had to contend with Chuck Noll and the Steelers of the 70s. Mike Tomlin has to contend with the New England Patriots and Bill Belichick. So you have dynasties going at the same time, where if Chuck Noll wasn't there, who knows how many Super Bowl championships maybe that the Oakland Raiders pick up? Maybe they get another 2, 3? Are they the team that wins 4 of them in the 70s? Very well could be. And you could even maybe make that same argument with the Steelers. And I know some people are going to be like, but still, this is even pre-Tomlin, too. You could go back to Bill Cowher, and Bill Cowher had some problems even with the Patriots, if you remember the famous Cordell Stewart game with the 3 interceptions, AFC title game. It's all relative here. And one of the things that I like to circle back around to also, and of course, I mentioned like Marv Levy, who didn't win a Super Bowl, and he's in there, and Tony Dungy, he has one, and it's like, and Tony Dungy had a heck of a coaching career with Tampa Bay Buccaneers too, before going with the Colts. So he's a multiple team coach there too. And I always make this argument that Tomlin would get snatched up right away, and some people like roll their eyes or whatever. And they like to point to, like, last year, they're like, well, look what the Ravens did, and they finish 14-2, and then they're one and done. And they lose to the 6th seed in the first game they play in the playoffs. And it's one of those things where, John Harbaugh is another guy. John Harbaugh is a guy I think of in the same kind of light of like a Bill Cowher type coach. I think he's an excellent coach too. As much as it pains me, I do have respect for the Baltimore Ravens. And when their fans talk trash, it carries a little more weight than when the Cleveland Browns try and bring it. and they fail to have anything after about week 3 or 4 each year. It starts to dissipate and disappear. But when you're talking with Harbaugh, they had to kind of rebuild too. The Ravens had a 9-7 season, 8-8, 5-11, and then they turn around. And actually, since winning the Super Bowl in 2012, they only made the playoffs in 3 of the following 7 seasons. And Harbaugh's playoff record, well, how many wins has he had during that span? Just the 1. And that's when the Steelers lost Le'Veon Bell. You had Ben Tate. I will continue to say this till the cows come home. I'm pretty sure Clete Blakeman was the referee in that game too, which was just completely hosed. But Ben Tate.
Oh, your favorite official.
Yeah, among one of them. I don't know why he always draws the Steelers-Ravens games. He's had or the Steelers and Bengals, or he gets some of these divisional games, and coming from an officiating background, I know it's a thankless job. The guy gets put in some really bad situations too. I believe he was the referee when Tomlin stepped on the field on Thanksgiving also. And sometimes he gets put back out there though. Like I more or less, I'm saying this because whatever, and it's not necessarily him, but somebody he had on his crew. I'll never forget, there was like a phantom. It was the only score that Dree Archer would have had in his life, and I believe it was that playoff game. And it was called back for a phantom hold old, and I'm trying to think who got tagged for it. But it was like it didn't exist. It didn't happen, and that kind of killed that game. But it was really Ben Tate. He couldn't control Terrell Suggs. He put the ball on the ground. Ben was getting hit. Not having Le'Veon Bell like really hurt them there back in that game was in 2015. I think it was the 2014 season. So, a lot of people have a bad taste in their mouth from the Jaguars too. When the Jaguars came in and they smacked the Steelers in the mouth twice in Heinz Field at that 2017 season, the bye and everything. And I think a lot of people still have a sour taste from that because the Steelers haven't been able to go back and get any type of redemption since then. They haven't been back in the postseason. But likewise, Harbaugh wasn't in there either. And that team had some patience, and they even rebuilt around Lamar Jackson and the things that they're doing, and a different offensive coordinator with Greg Roman. And the Steelers are in the middle of doing the same thing. They've just rebuilt their defense. They got a different offensive coordinator. Everybody wanted Todd Haley fired. And then they got him fired, and they're like, yay, Randy Fichtner. And then you do real well with Randy Fichtner in 2018, and you don't do so hot in 2019 because you don't have Ben Roethlisberger and a lot of other things that happen. Go back and listen to one of the other shows for that. I'm getting long-winded here, but it's still the same type of comparisons because, I could say these same things with like the Saints too, but I made the comparison in the same division. And within the same division, it really counts because the Steelers were rebuilding and doing some things like that. Well, the Ravens were doing the same things too when they lost like Ray Lewis or Ed Reed and, Marshall Yanda, Lodi Nada, Terrell Suggs, like all of these guys. Ray Rice is another guy by different circumstances. Of course, Joe Flacco's decline, and you had all these same things, and they keep reloading and rebuilding and being constantly competitive with the Steelers. You had the Bengals competitive with Marvin Lewis, who actually, believe it or not, as a regular season coach, not shabby, just couldn't get over the hill in the playoffs either. But this is all going on in the same division where, you can account for the Steelers winning a couple Super Bowls, this century, the last 2 decades, and the same thing with the Ravens. Amidst a dynasty built around this with the Patriots, one of these two teams is always running into one or the other, let alone within their same division trying to compete for maybe just the only playoff spot that's available. So, you got some of these other things with some of the other coaches to get in there too, but I had to throw that in just because I know we'll have the people that'll say, well, this happened in the playoffs and this happened in the playoffs and this, that, and the other thing. And it's just like, hey, this is the same thing that goes on with the guys that are, considered the best in the business right now too. That includes Pete Carroll. That includes John Harbaugh. That includes, not Bill Belichick, obviously. Sean Payton was my other guy there. And who knows, maybe Mike McCarthy gets back in that conversation with the Cowboys here in the near future. He was definitely in that part of the conversation when he was with the Packers, took a year off. So we'll see what ends up happening. And now you got to worry about some juggernaut with Andy Reid and, Patrick Mahomes buying part of a baseball team based on the new contract he got and all this other stuff. So it's just some wild things, but I don't know where you want to put a bow on some of this. I've always had a tremendous amount of respect. I thought we had to have like a little bit of a Mike Tomlin show here, and really it's going to be really challenging going forward. If you thought last year up until, losing the last 3 games of the season and just having running out of gas, I guess. Playing, they're playing with house money, doing flying by the seat of their pants with who knows who playing quarterback or running back or who they're throwing the ball to on offense. And you thought he did a fine coaching job and thought he was in the Coach of the Year conversation maybe up until that point, and still had the Steelers. It still took up to the last week of the season to officially eliminate them from the postseason. If you thought that was a fine coaching job, just wait. They're doing everything by Zoom meetings now, and you're going to have like these, I don't know if they have an official bubble, but you got all these different COVID-19 things that are going on and, separating some players, larger practice squads, and all these different rules that are going to change the way that the game is not only played, but coached going into 2020. We may not have seen Mike Tomlin's finest job yet.
Yeah, I definitely think that if it wasn't for all the complexities of the current health situation, across the world and trying to come up with different rules and finding out if players are going to opt out of playing and assuming that he gets his full complement of roster, that stays healthy and plays, I don't see why Mike Tomlin shouldn't be in a discussion of being one of the better coaches heading into this 2020 season.
Yeah, and I'm going to steal a line from Brian and say absolutely. So, well, I put you on the hot seat. Based on some of the other guys that aren't in yet, like let's say a Shanahan or a Dan Reeves or somebody like that, do you think Mike Tomlin's done enough yet? Because I always felt like maybe Bill Cowher hadn't done enough to maybe be a Hall of Fame coach. But now that he's gone in, I mean, I felt Jimmy Johnson winning those two and the Cowboys being like, practically great and almost like a mini dynasty there. That was considered a dynasty, folks, before the Patriots came along. And the Patriots are doing things that have never happened and probably won't be replicated ever again, probably even starting this year. But also helps they had a division where the other three teams were pretty miserable for the last 15 years or so as well. But I got to wonder if Mike Tomlin has done enough and if there's anything more that he needs to do to prove that he could be a Hall of Fame caliber coach. I think the main thing is if he goes another 2-3 seasons of 500 and above ball, let's say the next 3 seasons, 2-3 seasons, let's say everybody's got their saddles hitched together here. We're talking about Ben Roethlisberger, Mike Tomlin, Kevin Colbert, and even Marquise Pouncey for that matter, who said he goes when Ben goes, right? I think if those guys go, let's say 3 years, they make the playoffs, 2 of them, they get to at least an AFC championship. A Super Bowl is a lock, but let's just say they make the postseason 2 or 3 of the next 3 years, 2 division titles maybe. Maybe they trade with the Ravens. Is that enough to get Mike Tomlin into the same type of talks of being a Hall of Fame caliber coach, you think, based on all the research that you saw and did here?
I think it will, because if you look at Tomlin, some people will say, well, he only got us just to 500. That still counts as a winning season. And the whole time he's been with the Steelers, he's never had a losing season. So say he stays 3 more years and he adds 3 more winning seasons. Like you said, 500 or better. I was looking at some of these players or some of these coaches that already have the Hall of Fame designation. And I think he's going to definitely be in the Hall of Fame discussion if he were to not have any losing seasons during his tenure with the Steelers and get the Steelers back to a Super Bowl. I can almost guarantee if he can get 2 Super Bowl wins that he'll match Bill Parcells, Vince Lombardi, Jimmy Johnson, Tom Landry.
Yeah.
I don't know how if with the and some of those I just listed didn't even have the same win-loss percentage from the playoffs. No. Tomlin had the better records.
No, not at all. And you even look at this. I mean, Mike Tomlin, 13 seasons. I mean, Tony Dungy, 13 seasons as well. I think it is important to note with just the 1 Super Bowl victory. And he had 139 wins, 668 is his percentage. Tomlin's at a 642. He's not far behind here. He goes another 3 seasons and wins, let's say even 9 or 10 games a year at the minimum. That's another 30 wins. That would get him the jump. Who else is actually the other guys that are still current here? Could be kind of neck and neck if you look at, like, let's say Pete Carroll, for example, or Sean Payton. Mike Tomlin and Pete Carroll have the same amount of victories at this point in time, 133. Pete Carroll has actually coached 1 extra season. Payton is 2 victories behind. These guys could start to climb the list, but you're starting to talk about Joe Gibbs territory. But it's still interesting, too, because, like I mentioned, there's still Tom Coughlin, Mike Shanahan, and guys like that are sitting there. I mean, Tom Coughlin has the 2 Super Bowl victories, and so does Mike Shanahan. But they both coached 20 years. We're talking about these guys could put up these numbers having only coached maybe 15 years in the same category there. It only takes, let's say, 10 wins. However you get 20 wins in the next 2 seasons, and you're going to get an extra game each of these seasons too. So you're going to go to 34 games, 20-14 isn't necessarily something that's out of the stretch of the imagination here. If you make Tomlin 153 victories, he now surpasses Bill Cowher, surpasses Marv Levy, surpasses Tony Dungy, and he would only be a game behind Joe Gibbs, and only a handful of games maybe behind Bud Grant, also a Hall of Famer. It's just, it's a very subjective thing, and you don't know how necessarily the criteria is for some of the voters who are out there to do the Hall of Fame thing. And, I'm sure I don't know how else to tiptoe around this, so I'm just going to come out and say it as it needs to be said. There may be something here, too, for Mike Tomlin being a African-American head coach, too. So that may be something that being one of the faces of the league, especially when you have some of the controversy that comes around as to Rooney Rule, for example, any type of affirmative action, I think that's something that might be considered as part of it. I think he's great regardless. You don't have to put that into any of the conversation. I'm just saying that's something that might get him over the finish line where a few of these other coaches may not have. Obviously, the fewer seasons, all the other wins, one more Super Bowl definitely puts him in there because there just aren't a whole lot of people who win a lot of Super Bowls. Bill Belichick has 6. Chuck Noll has 4. Gibbs and Bill Walsh have 3. No one else has more than that. Okay? Those are your top 4. Everyone else, you got a bunch of guys that are here, mixed in here with 2s. And, you could, Tom Flores, for example. 12 seasons, but he was 97 and 87. He got in there. He only had 5 years and made the playoffs, but they got in with the Super Bowls there. And I said the same thing. Like you got like a guy like George Seifert, for example, too. That's part of this. That's played in 2 Super Bowls. So. It's some interesting stuff, Tina. I don't want to waffle much more as we're getting up against it, but it's definitely something that's food for thought. And, when you start to compare, there may be a few more names that are deserving to go in the Hall of Fame. Absolutely. Tomlin's not done yet. So at best, if he coaches another 2-3 years, we're looking at least 8 years from now before he even gets on the ballot. Would he be a first ballot guy? It all depends, I guess, what happens before he calls it quits, before he decides to hang it up. And you could be looking 10 years down the road. A few of these other names that we said might make it in there. And then that further supports the argument for Tomlin being one of the greater coaches in NFL history. So, hey, any closing thoughts that you might have, since this was really your baby, and that's the reason I brought you on. Plus, we wanted to hear from you. I think some folks definitely should hear from one of the more instrumental contributors that we have here at Steel City Underground.
Well, I appreciate that.
Oh, it's well deserved.
I want to leave one question. I've never done this with the podcast before. But I want to leave a viewer question or a viewer / listener, since we're on different podcast services. If you were to choose between Tony Dungy, Sean Payton, and Mike Tomlin, because like you compared earlier, they've all coached the 13 years. They have very similar statistics. Out of Tony Dungy, Sean Payton, or Mike Tomlin, let us know which coach you think would be the most likely to get in the Hall of Fame and which coach you, the listener, would rather have coaching your NFL team. And let Steel City Underground know.
Yeah, I think it's very easy for me. We've seen how Sean Payton, they did well with Teddy Bridgewater last year in absence of Drew Brees, so it kind of swings back the other direction there. But before, it was very quarterback-driven. We've seen Tomlin time in and time out. A lot of people knock for Ben Roethlisberger not being healthy, suspension the 1 year, and they go to the Super Bowl. They didn't have him for 4 games. And they start with Dennis Dixon, end up with Charlie Batch. We've seen him get it done with guys like Byron Leftwich. We've seen him get it done with Michael Vick and Landry Jones. And, man, did they really try with Mason Rudolph and Duck Hodges. And, you won't get me to say anything bad about Mike Tomlin. So keep it clean in the comments. I know, the final comment about any type of thing with the race thing could be a controversial subject, but it's still one that in our present day political climate and things of that nature is definitely something that will probably be alluded to. And when we're talking about 10 years down the road, I don't think things are going to change much from now until then, particularly in that sense. So, again, keep it civil. We always tend to have some good conversations with our listeners and supporters out there, especially some of you out there on YouTube. And some of us even find us on YouTube just to be able to leave a comment. We truly appreciate it. We appreciate all the kind words. And I appreciate you, Tina, taking time out of your day to join me. And hopefully we don't make it too far and few between, I know you usually jump in with Brian when I'm not available. So this time, this was a nice change of pace when Brian was unavailable to have you come on. And we'll have to do it more often.
Yeah, sounds good. And the reason I jump on with Brian is because usually it means that you're away from the quote unquote office, and him and I can kind of get up to trouble and not get caught.
When the cat's away, the mice will play.
That's it.
Yeah, well, you still get caught sometimes. I listen to them, and that's usually when that happens is in season, and who knows? I don't know if I'm going to be traveling to go see some of these games, and I still listen to you guys when I'm in the car. That's usually what I'm thinking about. Right now, I got that picture in my head. I'm listening to you. It's like late night. I'm driving back from somewhere, either like a game, or I catch up to it traveling to the next game. You know what I mean? Because then I'm busy during the week trying to do all this other stuff. So for all our listeners out there too, don't forget, you can go back and listen to a whole lot of this stuff if you need to get your football fixed. There's quite a few topics we have here in the podcast archives over the summer that have not aged poorly, as some of your, freezing cold takes on the internet might be like. So we encourage you to go back and listen to some of that back catalog. Hopefully you're starting to get a little more geared up, psyched up for football. Now that, we have some idea of the direction that hopefully the season appears it's going to be happening. There's still some things that are hanging here and there, and we'll be getting to those, probably in the next week or so, as well as we continue to get more news and things of that nature. So don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe as usual. My name's Joe. Her name is Tina. And until next time, we encourage all the listeners out there to be safe, be good, and we'll catch you later.
We would like to thank you for listening and remind our listeners to follow us on social media and our website, www.steelcityunderground.com.